All right. So we are going to kick off this new unit talking about plant development and focusing on flowers and their role in sexual reproduction, but as well as how plants have this ability to reproduce without having to undergo sexual reproduction. And that we would call that vegetative or asexual reproduction. The plant body is composed of four parts. The root system, which major role is to absorb water and nutrients as well as provide support for the plant. The stems are transporting water and nutrients as well as sugar throughout the plant out to the leaves, whose major role is for photosynthesis. And then the flowers, which main role is reproduction. Similar to other bodies, whether they're animal or human, they are composed of tissues, in this case, plant tissues. And a tissue is really just a group of cells that perform a similar function. And it's possible in the context of whether we're talking about leaves or stems or roots or flowers, they can be composed of more than one tissue type that make up the organ and more than even one cell type they can make up that tissue that can make up the organ. And we'll talk more about that as the semester goes along. So, we are going to focus on flowers. And one of the biggest roles that flowers play is to attract pollinators. A fair bit of energy goes into producing a flower by the plant. And these flowers, while we can appreciate them, we recognize that their role is to attract pollinators to allow for cross pollination. So these insects are attracted maybe by the scent or by the nectar or by the pollen that the flower emits. And this reward for visiting this flower is that scent or that nectar or pollen reward, but ultimately the plant is also rewarded by that insect visiting because it is bringing pollen from its anthers to another flower, and that's going to really help with cross pollination. Pollination is really just simply the transfer of pollen from the male parts of the floral uh, plant organ to the female parts. It could be within the same flower, it could be within a different flower on the same plant, or it could be from the flower on one plant to the flower on another plant. And so in this diagram, it's really just showing that you might have two flowers. They could be side by side. They could be spread across a field 100 feet from each other. But really, two of the same plant can receive pollen from one another. And this is moving the pollen from the male organ, which is the anther, to the female organ, which is the pistil. Many plants transfer their pollen in a process we call cross pollination or outcrossing. And this is moving that genetic material that's in the pollen from flower to flower. And this, in general, we say is good for improving genetic biodiversity. However, some flowers can receive their own pollen, and we call that self pollination. Also, plants can move their pollen without the aid of a pollinator through wind, through water, but also other animals that are not insects, like bats, for example, can help move pollen in some flowers. Now, self pollination could be as simple as the anthers that are denoted in these yellow tips here can dehiss or release their pollen right onto the female part of the flower, which is the stigma here in green. You can see that arrow pointing at it. And so, literally, it just falls onto its own flower part, and then the fertilization takes place. Or the pollen can fall out of the this particular flower and float onto the flower of another flower on the same plant, and that would also be considered self fertilization. And this is fine. Some plants can do self-fertilization and outcrossing, and we'll talk more about why that is beneficial here as we go along. But cross-pollination is really vitally important for maintaining genetic diversity. And what I mean by that is that if you're continuously receiving your own pollen, that population of plants will continuously receive its own genes, and there'll be very little genetic diversity. And so that'll make it at risk for disease and many other issues that happen when you have low genetic diversity. And so one of the roles of a plant breeder is to improve genetic biodiversity. And this really makes for a healthy plant population. So in addition to bees, and we said other animals like bats, we can also have moths and butterflies that can do a fair bit of pollination. And we rely on these pollinators. Many of them are native. In fact, in Indiana, just if we're talking about bees for a second, there are between 300 and 400 native bees to Indiana that do a fair bit of cross-pollination for a lot of our food crops. If we think about it globally in food production, 35% of our global food production relies on pollinators, many of which are native to our region, and some, like the honeybee, which is not native to the United States, also plays a very important role in food production. Foods that we like in our diet, like apples or pumpkins, avocados, citrus, rely on pollinators, even almonds, for example. If we didn't have this wide diversity of insects that are capable of pollinating our food crops, that would really limit our food supply and we would have less choices. Okay? In fact, even over here, if you notice, even chocolate would be at risk if we didn't have bees to do the work. Honeybees have gotten a lot of attention for their decline. They are not native to the United States. They're actually European in descent. And that means that they are at risk for diseases and not being adapted to the habitat or the environment as well as native bees are here. So they have some pressures on them already from just not being native to the United States. But they are fairly good pollinators. They are live in community, which makes them easier to sort of culture and bring them farm to farm to allow for pollination services to take place from farm to farm. If you want to ensure that your food crop has adequate pollination, you can hire out a bee farmer that can come to your farm and bring you bees to help fertilize your crop. That's a pretty common practice here. We also rely on honey for a food source, but we know that they are at risk. And about 20 years ago now, we saw this, what we're calling the honeybee colony collapse disorder, for lack of a better way of putting it, that really ultimately ended up being a series of factors that all kind of collided at the same time that led to this huge decline of bees, honeybees here in the United States. We have not really overcome that as a whole, and there are many threats that are still affecting honeybees today. Some of the biggest threats to our honeybees are overuse of pesticides, and this little mite here, this varroa mite, that really attacks the larval form. And then this other one kind of called American foul brood, which is a bacterial disease. All of these are huge issues for bees that live in community, particularly, which is unique for honeybees. They're the only bees in the world that do live communally. And so it's easier for them to spread their illnesses one to another, and or for mites or other insects to get in and invade the hive. Not to say that native bees aren't also at risk, because they are. Their issues are in other ways, in that they have lack of habitat. They don't have a stable food supply, and they're also at risk for overuse of pesticides. So, in general, our bee situation is somewhat dire, whether we're talking about honeybees or native bees in general. So the flower itself has several parts that this may be familiar to you from maybe a biology class a while back. But just to remind you, this flower right here has all of the reproductive parts as well as the other non-reproductive parts that makes a flower complete. So the sepal are these green leaves that are just below the petals. And if you can think of a flower bud, oftentimes there's this green set of leaves that are covering over the petals as a protective layer. Those are the sepals. And then just underneath that are the petals, and these are usually colored in some way. The sepal and petal combined gets a new name. It's called the perianth. So if you come across that term, it's just talking about the combination of sepals and petals. And then below the sepals is the receptacle, which is basically where the sepal joins to the stem, essentially. And so it's sepal, then the receptacle, and then just below the receptacle is the beginning of the stem, which we call the peduncle. So it goes peduncle, receptacle, sepal, petal. And those are the layers from the base of the flower to the petals. Now, on the inner part of the flower are the reproductive organs. And so the male parts are right here. The yellow tips here are the anthers that contains the pollen. And then they're suspended and then attached to the base here of the ovary, which are these little black sort of stem-like structures are called filaments. So the filaments attach to the ovary. So, at least in this picture. So you have the anther and the filament, that this is the reproductive part that is male, and collectively we call this the stamen. Then we have the female reproductive part, which is sort of denoted in three segments. We have the stigma, which is the outer top sort of sticky outer layer. And then we have this tube that is called the style. And then just below is the ovary. The ovary will eventually contain seeds and become fruit. And we'll talk more about how that happens. But all together, we call the stigma, the style, and the ovary, we call that the pistil. Okay. So if you look at it in this way, you can see the anther, and inside the anther are these chambers that contain the pollen, and that are attached to the filament, and altogether we call that the stamen. And then you see the pistil that has three parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Now, some flowers have all the reproductive parts. Some flowers do not. And so we have terminology that helps us explain whether they have all the parts or not. So a flower would be considered complete if it had all of the following, which includes the sepals, those green leaves, the petals, the colored, usually fragrant, looks like a petal, looks like a leaf, but is really not green, and then has both male and female reproductive organs. So if it has all of them, we say it's complete. If it's missing any one of them, even if it's just the sepals, we would say the flower is incomplete. Also, you can have flowers that may have sepals and petals, but only have male reproductive parts or female reproductive parts. And so we can have male only flowers or female only flowers. Okay. And one other important detail is that whether a flower can be self-fertile or not, if it has the male and female parts inside the flower, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pollen is going to reach the stigma. And so in this case, you can see that the anthers are below this stigma. And so they're there, but like the pollen is not going to easily just magically float on top of this stigma. So this arrangement kind of prevents self-fertilization. This one is more likely to see fertilization occur because the pollen is kind of lined up right next to the stigma. And then you can see here another example of the stamens are too far below that stigma. And so pollination, self-fertilization is not going to take place. Okay. Something that biologists also pay attention to is symmetry. And we'll see this in lab in a few weeks, is that some flowers are radially symmetrical and others are bilaterally symmetrical. Another way to put that is regular or irregular. So some flowers you can cut in any direction and make a pie, and we would say that's regular or symmetrical. And then if you can only see that they're symmetrical if they're same on both sides, only if you cut them down the center, we would say they're bilaterally symmetrical or irregular. So looking at these two examples here, if we look at this one, for example, it might be a little bit misleading. You might think, oh, it has the stamens, it has the pistil, it's got some petals. Surely it's complete. Well, what you can't see is there are no sepals here. So it's not complete. So we say it's incomplete. So lily is a good example of that. Wheat and oats are also incomplete. Compared to the rose, you can see its sepals, you can see its petals. And if you got in there and looked a little bit more closely, you'd be able to see the anthers that make up the stamens and the pistil and the ovary are all in there. Other examples of complete flowers include the bean and tomato. Again, this is just showing you that we can have perfect flowers where the stamen and the pistil is present in the same flower. Or you could have imperfect flowers where it's either going to be male or female. If it's both, it's perfect. If it's only got one, it's imperfect. Okay. It's kind of a mind bender. So you are going to have to think a little bit about imperfect and perfect, complete and incomplete, and what that means. Now, flowers come in all kinds of combinations. And so it's possible for some plants to produce a flower that is incomplete, but perfect, meaning that it's got the male and female reproductive parts, but it doesn't have petals or sepals. Or you can have some plants that are complete. It's got the petals, the sepals, the male and female parts. And because it has the male and female parts, we can say it's perfect. Okay, so here are some examples of that. So, why do flowers differ so much in morphology or shape? And how does that help the plant? You probably haven't thought that much about this, but we're going to look and see why. Why does it matter? Why do plants differ so much? Well, in part because of pollination and this idea of fertilization. So, the pollen grain ultimately, at the end of the day, needs to reach the stigma. And yet, some plants do not want to receive their own pollen. So they're going to do everything they can to arrange their reproductive parts so that they're never going to be close enough that the pollen is going to reach the pistil. Others are less worried about that and they're like, fine, we can be complete. We can receive our own pollen. That's fine. Okay. And as we go through the food crops, I'll give you examples of when self-fertilization is really important and other times where outcrossing or cross-pollination is really important. And I'll show you how the flowers differ. But ultimately, flowers take a lot of energy to produce. And so the plant is putting that energy into producing these really big showy flowers because they want to produce seeds. That completes the life cycle. That's their offspring. And so that starts with this fertilization event. So however it happens, whether the plant produces flowers that are complete or incomplete, perfect or imperfect, once the pollen has reached the stigma, then fertilization can take place. Fertilization just means that the pollen, which contains the male gamete, the sperm, is going to travel down the stigma into this area we call the ovary, which is where the egg resides. And then fertilization will take place because it'll be the joining of the sperm with the egg to form an embryo. And ultimately, that embryo will develop a fruit, which will then develop a seed. So you can see here that this pollination event is taking place, and it's not just one pollen grain having to reach that stigma, it can be many because most fruits have a lot of seeds in them, and each seed is one fertilization event or pollination event. So you can see all these seeds are being formed. Yep. So papaya and tomato and cucumber and pepper, these are all fruits with seeds on the inside. And so, as the fruit develops, it will mature these ovules, which are basically embryonic seeds. And these ovules will ultimately mature into seeds that will be released by the fruit and start the whole cycle all over again.